Welcome to this programme by the Radicalisation Awareness Network, where we discuss the issues that matter to our members. Today, we're going to talk about the impact of COVID on preventing and countering violent radical extremism. In the age of coronavirus, the terrorist and extremist challenge has changed. The pandemic has given new opportunities for terrorist and violent extremists to radicalise and recruit. Isolated, frustrated individuals, conspiracy theories, the widespread stoking of fear, increased community tensions, collapsed funding, and more difficult operating environments. These are just a few of the many things helping to create what some people call a permissive environment for radicalisation. Today we're going to talk to practitioners who are on the front line, as well as experts from the private sector, to look at some of these issues. But first, have a look at this. The confusion and fear triggered by the pandemic have been exploited by violent extremists whose influence extends around the globe. Groups like Al-Qaeda have framed the pandemic as the wrath of Allah and are growing in influence across Europe, blaming the pandemic on the West and encouraging their followers to reject governmental control. Violent right-wing extremists are attempting to accelerate a global race war by promoting anti-globalisation and anti-immigrant sentiment. Both sides use anonymous networks, private messaging with end-to-end encryption, and fake accounts to avoid surveillance and prosecution. The question, in an age of unfettered growth in digital communication, is what will it take to stop them? I'm now joined in the studio by Will Balday, a PVE coordinator who has first-hand experience of the impact of overseas influence on communities in Europe. Will, thanks for coming in. So what impact is this whole influencing effort having on the vulnerable community?
There isn't a community that's not been touched somehow by these overseas influences, whether you're a Muslim community who is being targeted by groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to resist the government guidance on COVID, or then under siege yourselves from the far-right communities who are now blaming you for some of these issues, or looking over to other communities, particularly white working class communities who traditionally have been targeted by the far-right for radicalisation, finding themselves isolated within their own communities, isolated within their own homes, immersing themselves in these narratives and starting to build on hostility to other communities themselves. So what we're seeing is a raising of the pressure and a raising of the tensions and the friction between communities. Now, at the moment, we're keeping a lid on it. If you consider it as a pressure cooker, the lid is still in place, because to one extent or another, we're not freely mixing on the streets as we have done previously. Our concern in PVE is that when our front doors open again and we then start taking to the streets and we start mingling and mixing as we used to before, those tensions and those pressures will somehow find a release in the real world. And for us in PVE, that's currently our biggest concern.
Is it difficult to be optimistic in this situation?
I am famously pessimistic around this work. If I'm brutally honest, I think the way we are seeing such an exponential proliferation of neo-Nazi narratives and conspiracy theories, I genuinely feel it's going to get worse before it gets better. My caveat to that would be that the day is always darkest before the dawn. So I think we will get through this and come out the other side of it. But I think we need to batten down the hatches and accept that it's going to get very difficult for a considerable period of time.
Earlier, we spoke to Veera Tuomala, who works for Save the Children in Finland, about what it's like for CSOs in this climate. In Finland, like the rest of Europe, the physical isolation of the COVID crisis has affected practitioners' ability to impact the most vulnerable.
It's more evident that not everyone knows what's going on in the field, especially because people aren't going outside as much anymore.
The rise in the popularity of violent right-wing extremism has continued online and on the ground.
With the youth workers we've talked to, they're genuinely concerned about this situation. Social workers that we've talked to, they're very concerned. The police are very concerned. It's so much about getting it into kind of a public consciousness.
But COVID's economic impact is going to have a knock-on effect for practitioners.
There are very likely going to be budget cuts, but we can't for sure say where they're going to be for right now, unfortunately.
But how are practitioners responding to the crisis?
I think definitely we've come very, very far in a very short amount of time. Coming up with new platforms that you can use safely and securely, and getting comfortable with those, I think, is very important. And just kind of having a mindset of, not everything has to be done face-to-face.
With so many of us becoming isolated, cut off from our friends and family, and with economies shrinking and increasing unemployment, there's no community which hasn't been affected by COVID. The long-term impact of COVID has yet to be seen. The International Monetary Fund has predicted that the global economy will shrink by almost 5% in 2020, impacting on income, job security and poverty. Combined with high levels of anxiety and isolation, this is a toxic mixture. The underlying conditions that lead to COVID fatalities are more common in social and economically deprived areas. With many service providers facing the very same problems, we are in a unique and delicate period of our professional history. We're now joined by Michelle Hassen, a French practitioner and an expert on youth, families and communities. How has this impacted on underlying community tensions?
Well, first thing I would say that it increased polarization between groups, between ethnical groups, and second point would be a rejection of the local authorities and the law enforcement authorities who are considered as sort of accomplice, and they may be pushed back to something very more dangerous, I would say, in terms of xenophobia, in terms of isolation, psychological isolation, but also social isolation. That would be a risk for democracy. So this very strong emotional insecurity, you can feel that when you are on the ground with certain group of people.
Michelle, thank you so much. We're joined now by Tom Drew, an expert in artificial intelligence and digital communication, who can talk a bit more about this. How has digital behaviour changed as a result of COVID?
I think that the communications environment around COVID-19 online, I think, is uniquely suited to the spread of disinformation. So you've got a global group of isolated people who all want to know about a subject. I think the combination of a thirst for information and a vacuum of advice from trusted sources made it incredibly easy for disinformation to flourish. And we've done some research into different forms of COVID-19 disinformation online. And the thing that we consistently see is that disinformation narratives can take hold incredibly quickly in this environment, and then are very, very difficult to shift from the minds of the people who are convinced by these narratives.
So what impact is the increase in terrorist content and disinformation having?
We've seen, in some cases, 3 times the amount of normal activity from terrorist groups and their supporters. And this puts a significant strain on the ability of online platforms, on regulators, on moderators to respond to this content and to remove it within a meaningful time frame for disruption.
So should those tackling these challenges take on new technology to respond?
I think in particular the major tech platforms know that they have to do more to safeguard their users, and those platforms have put in place quite robust measures to detect and remove terrorist content and disinformation. I guess the problem is that none of these deal, I think, sufficiently well with the release of new terrorist propaganda, which we know is the content that is most widely and most quickly disseminated online. And I think in order to do that, you need to deploy artificial intelligence. And if governments want companies to do that, as is now being suggested across Europe, governments need to support the cost of developing and deploying artificial intelligence.
So, Will, how can we remain optimistic in times like these?
We have to be, quite frankly. There is light at the end of the tunnel. It might seem far away. It probably is far away, but we need to be optimistic that we are now in their space. We can come up with strategies and devise techniques to challenge them in that space, offer people who are vulnerable alternative narratives, offer them support away from the digital world and in the real world. What we need to be able to do is to maintain that momentum in the online space, because the extremists that we're working against here, who are obviously targeting the same cohort of people we're worried about, they've been doing this a lot longer than us. They're much more adept at the technology than us, and they see this as a long game.
Will, thank you so much.